Hello and welcome to Nothing Definitive. My name is Sam, and today we're going to be talking about true and false values in the perception of reality. And this is a journal entry from April 13th, 2014. Something to be cautious of. It seems that all information absorbed by the mind is neither considered true or false until we apply a separate memory to it. Take, for instance, a young child who is learning about the world for the first time. You could tell it that a square is a square, and this would be considered true by both yourself and the child and society as a whole. Conversely, you could tell it that the square is a circle, and it would be true to the child while being false to yourself and society based on pre-existing belief in what your language means. But these true and false values don't actually exist. There's nothing in the universe that will validate whether a square is a square and not a circle, because this is a fabrication of our language and how we have agreed to interpret reality. Of course, I should stipulate that we're talking about language and not trying to put a square block through a circular hole in a child's toy. The child doesn't even necessarily take the square as being a square, or the child doesn't even necessarily take the square being a square as true, but rather more simply as a new pattern of neurons that means something meaningful to itself. True and false don't really exist until we learn and retain the concept of what that actually means. You could think of it as a separate memory you're actively or retroactively applying to past memories. Now, the problem here is that we seem biased towards accepting new information as true, almost as if it's a default value. Although, of course, we have the ability to be skeptical at some point in the future and suspect that incoming information might be false based on our pre-existing knowledge. It's like a skill we gain. When the child is older and you tell him or her that the square is a circle, they'll most likely not believe you anymore because they've, learned that that's not how things work or how society interprets it. But this isn't really an active function that we're controlling. I mean, how many people are actually challenging the data entering their minds? We watch TV, have conversations, browse the internet, and assume freely that what we're seeing is observational evidence for how the world works without properly vetting that information. Oftentimes I'll listen to others' conversations and think, how accurate are your statements? Because even a small amount of incorrect information could really poison how you and I interpret reality now and in the future. For instance, consider the impact of media conglomerates covering terrorist activities over the past couple decades. This constant fear of a potential attack, coupled with people conversing about it on a regular basis, could really warp people's perception of how dangerous the world actually is. Especially when you add on all the other stuff like domestic mass murders and other terrible tragedies. However, if you look at the statistics about the most prevalent dangers in Americans' lives, a terror attack is probably very, very far down the list, as are the others. I'm sure it's much more likely to be killed on accident than it is by a radical Muslim or a crazy gun-wielding psychopath. So without properly weighing both sides of this conversation, we can literally fill our minds with data that suggests an entirely different reality than the one that actually exists. How many people are watching that coverage and at the same time finding the actual statistics, reading blog entries by security experts who talk about the reality of the danger and all the other stuff? Probably not many. And what this then reveals is the damning question. What about bad data in my own past? And here's where the real insight lies. Here's where enlightenment can be found. Our own perception of reality, how we interpret the world around us, might actually be wrong. I had this crazy thought a while back that wondered about the lineage of our societal thinking. That who we are now and how we think and go about our business was literally decided by cavemen who got together and created the first rudimentary societies. What if we could think in an almost alien way had our ancestors decided to do something slightly different, or if a different ruler took power? I think we look at that as a timeline thing, where it exists only as a chain of events where we change an event and that changes the future, but maybe we should look at it as a change of perception. Events at a more fundamental level might just be choice made by humans based on how they interpreted reality. And if we change just a little bit about how they gather data back then, maybe it would cascade into an entirely different way of perceiving reality now. not just a change in events, but literally a change in how we think. It's just a fun thought. So let's jump back to me and you now. The damning question of our individual perception is important because it reveals a weakness in who we are. As a child, we are taught by our parents and teachers and friends and whoever else a version of reality that they know. Perception and knowledge is passed on, not really gathered by the current generation. And this is an important point. You are not the scientist. We take what is known and add to it rather than challenging it. Now, in some situations, this is good. This is why the scientific method is so awesome, because someone actually sat down and said, we need something that will produce reliable data so future generations can work off it confidently. This is why it's so important we maintain rigor when utilizing the method, because otherwise future generations will have no confidence in its results. They'll have to go back and fix everything. We have to be careful when producing scientific data, and it's one of the few places we can let our guard down and trust in the data. But it pretty much stands alone. Everything else in our lives should be challenged because most everything else is non-natural, non-physical. It's not bound by the rules of the universe. Pretty much everything else is conceptual and thus fabricated by another human mind. Society, government, economics, everything exists as a concept and an agreement between individuals. There's no guarantee that any of it is good or reliable or helpful to society or beneficial to you, whatever. We should be very cautious when accepting these notions into our lives. There are bad people in this world and tons of bad data. If you just run around absorbing it without meditating on what it really means, you're essentially just gambling with your own perception of reality. Right now, sitting here, there's no guarantee that either of us have any accurate bearing on what the world is really like. I would guess that the vast majority percentage, 90 plus maybe, of everything we quote unquote know is conjecture and assumptions. Is that really a good way of measuring reality? I don't think so. That is why I've gone to perhaps drastic lengths to tear down my own reality and rebuild it. That is why I've preached in the past, don't believe anything at all. There's no reason to. It doesn't seem helpful. Set your new default data value to null and proceed very cautiously with changing it to true or false. Be an observer to reality, not a participant in it. So that's what I have today. Obviously, I should actually add to this really quick before I close. Society and government and economics and stuff is good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should tear all that apart. We make do with what we have and make improvements to it. I'm just more saying on an individual level, be very skeptical about what other people tell you. A lot of people will tell you that this is how you should live life. This is what you should be doing. But they're just basing that on their own perception. And there's no guarantee that their perception is very accurate or even helpful. I think a lot of people give advice in this life, and I'm not sure they should. Especially since really as an individual, you're the only person in this entire world that really knows what the next step is for you. What is a good decision? You're the one that ultimately has to make that decision, and it's your responsibility, So just be cautious and really question a lot of things, and you'd be surprised how much that can really change your life for the better. Although I will stipulate that it can also be very difficult and depressing and just frustrating. So ease into it, or just be cautious with that knowledge too. Okay, so that's what I had for today. Thanks for listening as always. Please consider subscribing. Every subscription really helps a lot, so it both motivates me and it also just helps for my channel and the videos being found and that kind of a thing. So so thanks as usual, and see you next time.